sounds like a story to me. Some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't
I say it's your birthday. What's my birthday to you? I say it's your birthday. We're gonna have a good time.
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Well, I'm really excited about today's episode. I'm stepping in today. Emma and Rob have been doing an incredible job on all the Avram Davidson Universe podcast episodes. But today is a special episode, and they're going to be joining as well. But April marks, coming up later this month, marks Avram's, what would be Avram's 100th birthday. And so we decided we should all get together and do this special podcast again to celebrate Avram's 100th birthday. Our guest today is going to be Ben Railton, who's a professor of American Literature and Studies at Fitchburg State University. And he is interested in all things America, our literature and culture, our histories and stories, our national narratives and myths, our identity and future. We are going to be listening to an unpublished story of Avram's that I just can't believe it was never published. It is criminal that it was never published. And we'll discuss maybe why later on in this episode. But the title is What Time Is It? So that's it. I'm going to be bringing on Emma and Rob and Ben momentarily. Thank you so much for listening to me rant. And I'm trying to think of anything else to say before we get started. I think that's it. Thank you all for being part of the Avram Davidson universe. Please just spread the message. And I look forward to bringing you more Avram Davidson stories. And that's it. I'm looking forward to bringing on our guest. All right, everyone's here.
Yes.
So this is, I mean, really, this would be, I guess, happy birthday, Avram Davidson. I think that's what this episode is really about. And we're really lucky to have Ben as our guest. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. As I know, we'll talk a little about. I go pretty far back with Avram Davidson, but the chance to circle back around and find this new way to connect with his works and this new work, to me, new work, and to chat with you all about it and all the things that it kind of helps us open up is really exciting. I'm really excited for the chance.
Great. And I think we're just going to take turns asking us some questions, get into the story, and we'll just kind of make a little bit of a round table as well. Everyone, we should all chime in, and I'm looking forward to having some fun.
Awesome. Okay, so started. Ben, we'd like for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and the courses that you're currently teaching.
Sure. Thanks for asking. I am a professor in Massachusetts, professor of English and American Studies at Fitchburg State University in Massachusetts. In my 18th year here, teach and write about and think about all things American literature, American identity, American collective memory, national narratives, big questions of who we are. But the other thing I definitely wanted to make sure to highlight as part of this conversation, besides my experience with Avram that we'll come back to, is that I am also, on my mother's side, the great-grandson of Jewish refugees to the United States who fled pogroms in both the Ukraine and Russia around 1900, just before 1900, and settled here in Massachusetts as well, actually, in the Malden area. And so I think part of what drew me to Davidson originally was that family connection, as well as my interest in science fiction and in American literature and American identity, for sure. And I'm actually teaching classes on all those things right now. And I was thinking about how much this story that we're going to talk about intersects with kind of three different classes that I'm teaching at the moment. The obvious one for Davidson overall is that I'm teaching my Intro to Science Fiction and Fantasy class, which I get to teach every 3 years or so at Fitchburg State, and is a favorite of mine and a favorite for the students who take it, I think. And that was, again, my way in with Davidson originally was through his work as a science fiction author, a fantasy author, a speculative fiction author. But two other classes that really, I think, intersect with this story in really powerful ways. I'm teaching a graduate class right now on multi-ethnic American literature, and just thinking about the multiple layers of the American experience, from immigration to multi-generational family to prejudice and discrimination to all of the different issues that this story raises. And then the third one that I think really interestingly overlaps with this is I'm teaching a class on American short stories, the short story as a form, which again, when I read the Avram Davidson Treasury cover to cover, which I did as a young person, his mastery of the short story form is something that really, really impressed me. There's not a lot of authors who I think really master using short fiction in the way that he has, and the way I've been thinking about for my whole career. I teach a lot of short stories. So all three of those classes, I think, really interestingly kind of overlap with different layers of what makes a story like this so powerful.
Wow, amazing.
Thank you.
Similar family background, obviously, with myself and Avram, of course. So yeah, it was great.
Ben, your classes sound incredible. Also, your job sounds very cool. Very jealous. The science fiction class sounds really interesting. And engaging with Avram, you were talking about how he masters the short story. I wanted to ask you, you said you kind of first ran into him, I think, reading the Treasury, reading it from cover to cover. How do you like work with Avram teaching his stories to students? What do you kind of focus on, and what are some of the takeaways you go through in these classes with Avram's work?
Sure. And yeah, I mean, just quickly, because it was kind of an amazing serendipitous kind of moment that I think Davidson would appreciate. I was just working in a Barnes and Noble between college and grad school in my early 20s, and we were allowed to borrow books and read them and bring them back as long as we didn't do anything permanently destructive to them. And I just picked the Treasury off the shelf in the sci-fi section. It looked like a big book that I could spend a lot of time with, and I had never heard of Davidson at that point. And then thought I might dip into it, and I read the whole thing from cover to cover, however many 1,000 pages it is, however big that Treasury.
It's a big book.
It's a big book. So yeah, really, that was the serendipitous first moment. In terms of working with it with students, and this is a class where we do short stories primarily, just to give them a really wide range, because it's an intro to sort of all things speculative fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, weird tales, all sorts of other subgenres. So usually I only do one story from each author just to get the full variety, even though obviously there would be so many from a lot of the folks, including Davidson. And generally in that class, I've done the Golem, or Gollum, I say Golem, that story, because it's in one of the anthologies that I asked the students to take a look at, called, I'm blanking on the name. It's a fantasy stories anthology, and it includes the Golem. And so usually that's the way in. And what I love about that story is exactly some of the things that I was talking about, that it is at once obviously speculative, but it's also completely about Jewish American identity and family and community and these sort of very historical, social, cultural topics, yet inseparable from the fantasy or the speculative fiction in that story. So I think it opens up that layer of the whole class, because a lot of what we read are sort of obviously fantastic, set in alien worlds or Middle Earth or wherever. So having a story that is both things at once, fantastic and yet completely, again, historical, cultural, social, American, in that 50s, suburban moment, all those different layers of it. So that story in particular, I think students always love, because it brings things together in a way that feels unique, but also adds something to the whole genre when we're talking about it.
Out of curiosity, did you get a chance to listen to the Robert Silverberg episode?
Part of it, yes.
So I don't know if you listened to Leonard Nimoy reading The Golem, which I think would be a great episode at some point to share potentially. I don't know. You're welcome to with your students, but maybe they won't end up reading the story then, of course. But that's a different matter. Anyways, I was really excited to learn about that recording, and I have the full recording. So one of these days we can do a private session and we can all listen to it together. So yeah, no, it's great, and it's a fantastic story. Well, I say we should just get right into the story itself. What does everybody think?
Let's
Sure.
do
Let's
it.
do it.
Cool.
All right.
What Time Is It? By Avram Davidson. Uncle Moritz came to us one spring morning in my childhood, heralded by the sound of dynamite explosions. The freshness of that morning is, in its fullness, beyond recall. The maples arched the streets with thick green leaves. The locust trees were in white flower, and, a few blocks away, the Hudson ran joyously to the sea. I held my mother's hand and breathed the freshness of the earth. "What's that noise?" I asked. "They're blasting in Europe," she said jokingly. "Where Uncle comes from?" "Yes." I passed a schoolmate sitting on the wooden steps of her house. "Hello, Lois," I called. "We're going to see my new uncle. He's a greenhorn." My mother laughed. "Now, don't call him that to his face," she said. "Does he speak English?" "No, but he'll learn." Uncle Moritz was really my great-uncle. He had married the youngest sister of my grandmother, who was born after my grandmother at 15 had come to America. His trip had been planned for years. Everyone had saved for it, and even some of the American members of the family had contributed. The idea at that time was that Uncle Moritz's daughter, Maria, would come over. She would marry a citizen, she would be allowed to stay, would become a citizen herself, bring over her parents. The parents would become citizens and bring over the other children who were minors. The plan seemed foolproof. And then came the news that Uncle Moritz had decided to come instead of his daughter. "But why?" the angry question was asked. "He knows he can't stay. He just has a visitor's visa. He can't get in on the quota. The quota's filled up for 15 years. Ah, that quota. A faceless monster pawned by the immigration laws that kept in Europe people who asked nothing of life but to come to America. My grandmother's house had the look of bounty associated in my mind with religious celebrations, such as circumcisions, namings of baby girls, redemptions of firstborn sons, and confirmations. There was yellow sponge cake and brown honey cake, so unfailing in their presence at these occasions that I half thought they must have been ordained in the law of Moses. There were boiled chickpeas with salt and pepper, little pieces of pickled herring to which a stray clove or bay leaf still clung lovingly, mixed raisins and nut meats, candy, and pastry. Did I say pastry? A pale word, hardly adequate as a description of my grandmother's kuchen or strudel, her dark brown and moist spice cake. Not at all enough to define the crescent-shaped kipfel, said to be a relic of the days of the Turk, or the pogaks, formed like a Chinese persimmon and made with pounds of butter. In the midst of all of this, surrounded by aunts, uncles, in-laws, and cousins, whom I literally reckoned up by dozens, sat Uncle Moritz, holding a glass of tawny Tokai in his hand. After these years, when I try to bring back the features of his face, all I can recall are his mustache. It was long, his bald spot, and his gold teeth. He kissed me with an absent-minded, wine-scented smile. Uncle Moritz was not having an easy time of it. The inevitable question came up. "Why didn't you send the girl?" He moved uneasily in his chair. "Me? He made small, nervous smiles. He waved his free hand. The family waited, inexorable. At last, he said in a small voice, "I was afraid. Outrage and shouts. Afraid of what? I was afraid for her. But of what? He moved in his chair and looked as if about to weep. He mumbled something in a low voice, something about a young girl, a strange country, Indians, black people, and Chicago. Shouts and outrage. I was only a young girl when I came here. Does he think America's Borneo? There are no Indians here, said Aunt Martha. The black people are as civilized as you are, and Chicago is thousands of miles away. She fixed him with a long look. Essel. Jackass, she said. Pulled on her gloves with vicious jerks and stalked out. Poor Uncle Moritz. After a while, the indignation died down and was replaced with resignation. A poor thing, but our own, was the general attitude. Uncle Moritz got a job, a room, and a little red-covered book, out of which he began to learn English. I appointed myself tutor and had, of course, a great deal of pleasure. For example, the night he pointed to the clock and asked, "What tile is it?" Not until the mistake was explained to him and he laughed did I feel free to laugh. Thereafter, we had a password. Uncle Moritz would come up to me, give me a secret little nudge, and whisper, "What time is it, eh? What time is it?" He studied American history, and I, at the same time, learned Hungarian history. It is difficult to explain the position Hungary held in my imagination. I had never been there, nor my parents, and we had no particular desire to do so. We knew, it was not a matter of opinion, we knew that America was the finest country in the world. Everyone in Europe wanted to come to America, and would, if it weren't for the quota. My grandmother had come to America when she was 15. My grandfather came at 18. I've seen his naturalization certificate, the precious citizenship papers, old and tattered, in which he forswore allegiance to all foreign princes and powers, I think the phrase ran, particularly the Emperor of Austria, of whom I am now a subject. There, I think, was the phrase which allowed them all to retain Hungary in its special place, for they knew Francis Joseph in his capacity as King of Hungary only and not as Emperor of Austria. From my grandmother I received an impression, never entirely lost, of Hungary as a sort of cloud cuckoo land ruled by a storybook monarch called Franz Josef. Franz Josef rode in an ornate state coach, drawn by splendid horses, attended by footmen in strange garb. He went almost everywhere in this coach, or almost. When my grandmother wanted a euphemism for the privy, she called it the place where the König goes on foot. And when he alighted from his coach, red carpets were spread for him, which he always kicked aside, saying, "Let me walk on the earth like other men." And when people knelt to him, he would lift them up and say, "One kneels before the Almighty only." He called the people my children. On occasions of celebration, he would let the prisoners loose, dismiss cases awaiting trial, and remit fines. Franz Josef loved to play chess with rabbis and to hand them cigars, which they treasured as too precious to allow to go up and smoke. And in 1867, he emancipated the Jews and gave them full civil rights. My grandmother sang me old songs in the Magyar, pronounced Magyar language, learned from her aunt, who never married because her sweetheart had been killed fighting the Serbians. She told me how her old ma, my great-grandmother, then still alive, had taught her to spin, weave, sew, cook, and do all the household tasks. We had many servant girls, but my old ma said, "Sarah, if you marry a rich man, you will have to care for his household, and if you marry a poor man, you will have to do all these things for yourself." And so it happened. I married a poor man, and I had 10 children. Kein hara. No evil eye. From Uncle Moritz I learned of the long history of Hungary, how the Jews had settled there in Roman times, and how more Jews had come in with the Magyars over 1,000 years ago. He spoke of the Arpad dynasty, of Julius the Blind and Ferenc the Great, and of King Istvan's hidden crown. I learned of my grandmother's great-great-grandfather, who lived in the days of the Holy Roman Empire, drank a glass of schnapps with his breakfast every morning, and died at the age of 114. They told me of how the men of our family had fought under the Great Kossuth in the Hungarian War of Independence. Uncle Moritz himself had been in the World War, although, I realized to my secret dismay, on the wrong side. Grandmother had no such worries. Hungary's fight was with Russia or Serbia or some such place. It had nothing to do with the war in which 3 of her sons had served against Kaiser Bill, as she still called him. Grandmother was a registered Republican and remained loyal to Hoover till the bitter end. But, after all, could one compare Hoover to Franz Josef? No. Absurd. The time went quickly. Uncle Moritz's visitor's visa lapsed, was renewed, lapsed again, and was renewed for the 3rd and last time. Only 6 months to remain in America. What did he expect, after all? I really don't know. Perhaps he thought to make enough money to maintain his family in comfort forever. Or that the law would be changed, that the president would issue a proclamation, or the government would forget about him, one little person among so many millions. He often spoke of his children, my cousins, and I felt that I knew them. He had the one daughter, Maria, who would have come to America if he hadn't been afraid, and 3 sons, all of whose names ended in or, Andor, Sandor, and Tybor. The village took shape before my eyes. There were white houses that looked like outdoor ovens and silvery oxen with tremendous horns. The women wore embroidered dresses, and the men's costume was quaint and archaic. Greensward was everywhere, the brightest green that ever was, and the peasants with staffs in their hands drove geese to market. At evening the cows returned from pasture, and each cow knew her own home and turned aside to it. There were great landowners like Count Sapogny and Count Esterhazy, and in the distance, on the hills, the magic coach and horses of the king, reduced to doll size, galloped along, preceded by tootling trumpeters. In Hungary, America had been fairyland. In America, Hungary was fairyland. Once, Uncle Moritz had gone riding with us on Sunday. It was one of his infrequent times out of the city. We rode along past open land for miles and miles. "Who owns this land?" he asked. "I don't know," my father said. "Someone must own it." "Maybe the county owns it?" "What is the county?" "Part of the government." "Is it a hunting reserve?" "No." "What then? What do they do with it?" "Nothing." "Nothing! That is immoral. In Hungary, this land would support thousands of people. So much land, such a big country with so much room, and they will not let people come in or stay. I do not understand it all." So, at last, still not understanding, Uncle Moritz packed up to leave. Sad as he was, he saw my own sad face and began to smile. He poked me in the ribs and whispered, "What time is it, eh? What time is it?" And then he left. He wrote back once or twice, After the war, my grandmother received a letter from Hungary with a familiar postmark, but she did not know the handwriting. It lay on the kitchen table for a day. She was afraid to open it because she had heard nothing from her family since the war. It was finally opened, with all of us sitting around the table. The letter proved to be from an old woman who had known my grandmother in their childhood. It addressed her as High-born Lady. The opening lines were equally formal. Then, with grief and sorrow I have to tell you, dear lady, of what happened to your family and to all our Jews here in this village. It was after the Germans had come, but to our eternal shame I must tell you that it was our own police who carried out their orders. I asked them, Christian men, how can you do this thing? But they laughed and said that at last they would get rid of the foreigners. I am an old woman. There was nothing I could do. One child I hid. I could see them going by in the trucks. Your honored sister and her husband and children, your honored brother and his family. None returned, dear lady. The world is dark, and there are no Christians anymore. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, pray for us. From time to time since then, I've had a dream, a very short one. A row of white houses like ovens stands behind a green lawn. A peasant with a staff in his hand is driving geese before him. A tiny coach rides rapidly across the lawn, and in it, beaming and nodding and waving and stroking his white whiskers, is Franz Josef. The white houses, I realize, are ovens, real ones, and the geese are Jews. I watch them file into the ovens, over the doors of which are written, Emancipation of the Jews. And then I hear a voice, a loud whisper, which asks over and over again, What time is it? What time is it? What time is it?
Whew. That story, every time I listen to it or read it, I struggle. It's a tough one. It gets me every time. Ben and everybody else, I'd love to just kind of initial reactions, thoughts, and we'll maybe get into some more specific questions, but any initial thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about with the whole of that story, and I'm looking forward to it. But one thing that I was thinking about a lot in reading it and being equally struck, as you were saying, Seth, and I've read it a couple times since the first time over these last bit of time, and it's each time I'm struck. But one thing I really was thinking about was that my understanding from what you've told me is that this was probably very early in Davidson's career that he drafted this anyway, that he first wrote it as a 20-something, it sounds like. And so, I mean, just besides that, being struck by that because it's so masterful, again, he just was so gifted with using the form and words and language to capture things that are so difficult and powerful. But the other thing I'm struck with is it's obviously not a fantasy story or speculative fiction story in any official way, right? Quite the opposite. It's so real. But I think it's a story about fantasy, fantasies that the narrator has of Hungary, fantasies that Hungarian Jews have of America, fantasies that they all have of Franz Josef and the Hungarian government, fantasies of equality and justice, and then all these realities instead or in contrast. And so I think it's a story about that gap in a lot of ways between all these fantasies and then the hard historical, social, cultural realities and tragedies. And then that just makes me think about the idea of then spending a career in part trying to think about the the best version of fantasy, the best version of speculative writing, when these are some of the worst, I would say. So that's part of what really stood out to me in thinking about it.
Emma, Robert, anything? What jumped out at you guys?
Well, personally, what jumped out to me was the somberness of it, especially since it began with the what time is it is a playful phrase that the uncle and the narrator used together. And so it really made it way more impactful at the end. Sorry, I'm still kind of like, emotionally processing it. It hits pretty hard. And it just that, yeah, the sheer contrast between the magical sort of, even Uncle Moritz himself is kind of a fantasy in his mind before he arrives. And then he turns into fantasy again at the end as this sort of disembodied voice. I see what you're saying, Ben, about it being like fantasy and reality. Those are my initial thoughts.
Robert?
I think so too. The fantasy setup that is fun and kind of delightful, even though the narrator's uncertain about Uncle Moritz at first, they have a really nice relationship eventually, and they're just kind of starting it. And a big part of that is the what time is it? What time is it? And it's the whole fantasy, along with how he envisions Hungary, the geese, the different houses, this fairyland, as he calls it. He starts to imagine it in his head. He never thought about Hungary before. It's all stolen. It's completely flipped and turned into a reoccurring nightmare because their whole family's murdered. Everything is taken away. So it's interesting to see, like you said, Ben, the fantasy turned into a terrible reality, and they have to confront that awful reality. So it is interesting to see how Avram uses fantasy and can show us the fun in fantasy, but then what happens when our fantasy gets taken. It's very interesting.
Wow.
And just to add one more thing along those lines too, that, as an American Studies scholar and as somebody who writes and thinks about immigration a lot, that's one of my main through lines. It's also the case, of course, that America not living up to some of the fantasies is a direct contributor to that, right? Not only because Moritz can't stay because of the Quota Act, but also, as we know, and as I'm sure Davidson knew, even though it's only implicit in the story, turning away refugees, turning away the St. Louis, turning away those who were trying to escape that one world for this other one. And so those multiple layers where the US has also sort of let down the fantasies at the same time that certainly Hungary and its community have. So these multiple gaps, these multiple layers of that Moritz and the narrator sort of are each defined by, in a way. He's Hungarian, the narrator's American, but they both feel those gaps so distinctly.
And even like another layer is that at the end of the day, this horrific thing happened in Hungary, country that extension of the family was trying to leave. So on that bare bones level, America is the fantasy land. Whatever that dream is what it is. It may be difficult, impossible to get into it, but it's kind of sobering to have this fantasy of this beautiful land and then to realize that the reality that you're in is actually better than that, or is as good as it could get, if somebody could get what it is that you have.
Yeah, that's
spot on. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and whenever there's a first person narrator in a story, one of the things I always try to think about and ask students to think about is when they're telling it and writing it, right? And clearly he's older. We don't know exactly how old, but he's significantly older than the kid. He says at the end, I have this dream, periodically from over some years, right? And so thinking about him reflecting on all those things in some present as well, whatever exactly that present is. And so it's also about, those questions across his own life, right? And across the arc of childhood to whatever stage of adulthood he's in as he remembers and reflects. And I think first person is so important for that reason, right? Because it allows us to ask the question of not just like who's narrating, but when and how, and thinking about the stages of their voice and all those kinds of questions too. But sorry, Seth, I interrupted you.
No. I mean, I have so many thoughts on this story. I mean, I could spend an hour talking about it, but I'd say a few highlights. Number one, and some of this you may or may not have seen, but when he wrote it, it was under A.A. Davidson. So this was even before he'd taken the name Avram. And I think, I'm not sure how many of you know this. I talked about it on the Beer episode. His given name was Adolf, which I can't imagine an Orthodox Jew having to live through that with that name. And you can understand why he would change his name, obviously, for obvious reasons. This was A.A. Davidson was when he was writing very early Jewish work. So this was he was young. I mean, how did this come? He didn't go to college. He spent some time, but I mean, pure genius in terms of his writing ability. He's probably in his 20s when he wrote this, late 20s. You tell me how many 20-year-olds would write something like that. I'm just blown away. And then I just see a lot of connections to his later stories. You see, he talks about the Hudson. Obviously, he's talking about his time in Yonkers, Greenhorn. That brings up the Slovo stove. You think about the description of food that Avram writes about in so many of his stories. I mean, I got hungry listening to some of the food, and I'll apologize. The narrator, I think, did an incredible job. I think maybe I apologize in advance to anyone if some of the names weren't pronounced exactly correctly. But I mean, some of that food sounded wonderful. Again, Slovo stove, beer, a quiet room with a view, the chicken, that was another episode that, just his descriptions. He talks a bit about, I don't know how many of you have read the Esterhazy series or stories, but this really ties, I think, his descriptions of Hungary, I think, are later descriptions of Scythia, Pannonia, Transbalkania, which was where it was the, I think, 4th or 5th largest empire in Eastern Europe around the turn of the century. It make-believe empire. But Franz Joseph was clearly, the emperor of this is clearly based on Franz Joseph. I mean, you can see a lot of connections. Oh boy, what else? A couple other things. He even mentions Count Esterhazy, which is, again, the Esterhazy, the Adventures of Dr. Esterhazy. And then I'd say just a couple of other points where he talks the fear that really struck me of Eastern Europeans coming to the United States, of Indians, Black people, Chicago. And one of the things, again, Avram served in the military as a medic. And one of the things that he touched on in a lot of his letters was how awful African Americans were treated. And I just loved, they're as civilized as we are. That comment meant so much to me, again, written in the late 40s. And then I'd say the line that really struck me is obviously so much room and will not let people stay. That line is just brutal, especially when you know what happens. So anyways, I could go on forever. There's so much.
Wow. Well, yeah, in terms of the historical context of this, Ben, one question we have for you is, how on point was the story historically in terms of the details?
I think very much so, particularly on, I can't speak as much to Hungary, for example, although my guess is there's a lot of layers beyond the fantasy to some of the realities of that complicated multi-ethnic and multicultural space of its own. But on the American side, on the side of early 20th century, let's say first half of the 20th century, US history and identity, I think it's really importantly accurate about the aftermath of things like the Quota Acts of the 1920s and what America was in the 20s and 30s, kind of up to the point of World War II, which maybe now we're starting to grapple with a little more as we're sort of in the 100th anniversary, ongoing 100th anniversary of that moment of the 1920s and after. But for a long time, I think we've minimized how deeply discriminatory and kind of white supremacist dominated and exclusionary that moment in America was, while at the same time you continued to have, despite those best efforts of white supremacy, you continued to have these multi-generational immigrant arrivals and families and communities, including, of course, Jewish American ones and so many others. And so even just that tension, right, of this continued development of communities, despite this moment of deep exclusionary prejudice and the attempts to kind of, for the first time on the truly national level, I would argue, make America less diverse. There had been all kinds of debate over those questions throughout our history, but starting in the 1920s with the Quota Acts until the 1960s, really, our national policy was to try to make America less diverse, more Anglo-Saxon, as those laws termed it. And so thinking about what it meant to grow up in that world, what it meant to immigrate or, visit that world, as Uncle Moritz does, what it meant to be a multi-generational Jewish American community in that period, so dominated by the Ku Klux Klan, by those exclusionary laws, by all these levels of prejudice and white supremacy. And then how all of that still is sort of context for just, family and childhood and the simpler pleasures and relationships of being a kid, of meeting a new relative and establishing this bond with him, of food, of all the things that we're talking about. So to me, that's the incredible accuracy, dealing with like the multiple layers of tension in American identity in this incredibly complicated period of the 20s and 30s, let's say. But at the same time, also reflecting just what it meant to grow up as, a second generation kid, third generation kid in that moment from any community, and certainly from this particular one. I think it's one of the best stories I've read at reflecting those multiple layers of, again, the first half of the 20th century in America on those multiple fronts. So really, that's what struck me as an Americanist so powerfully, even before the incredibly powerful ending. Just all those layers of a historical fiction, which is what I would call it, and also, again, a kind of fantasy adjacent fiction, dealing with that moment, with that period.
Thank you.
Ben, because when I think of Avram, I often think, okay, he's got the Esterhazy series, he's got essays that are about fantasy elements and the history of fantasy, and he's got lots of science fiction and fantasy stories. You've talked a little bit about how this story has fantasy elements in it and how it's fantasy or speculative adjacent. But how do you see this story kind of in conversation with the later, more fantasy sci-fi works, ones that are definitively sci-fi or fantasy? Or do you see this kind of concern for what's happening in society or what has happened in history continuing in those later speculative works too?
Absolutely the second thing. The story of his, when I read that collection back in the day, that stuck with me the most, and I had mentioned this to Seth when we were talking originally about Davidson, was the story, The Necessity of His Condition, which is the one about I did not reread it for tonight. I was focused on this story, but I'm pretty sure it's a guy who is a slave, either a slave owner or a slave trader. I want to say he's a slave trader who then sort of finds himself transmogrified into the body of an enslaved person and realizing that other side of enslavement and racism and so on. And so that's obviously a hugely fantastic conceit, speculative conceit, but one that's entirely about historical, cultural, social conditions, as the title suggests. And so I think there's a spectrum of like how much is the fantastic and how much is the historical, social, cultural commentary. And these two stories, that one and this one, are at different places on that spectrum. But I think they're still asking those questions and thinking about the relationship of our fantasies and our realities. So I think there is a continuum there. But to go back to something that Seth had said, I also think it's interesting that in this early part of his career, Davidson is maybe a little less speculative, right? And a little more realistic, a little more thinking directly about Jewish identity, a Jewish American experience. And then that makes me think that this story in part reflects somebody who maybe, not to overread it, but comes to decide maybe that speculative fiction is a necessary lens to look at some of these things through because they're so hard to look at. I could only imagine what it would have meant psychologically to try to write stories this painful and powerful for a whole career. I think it could have been impossible. And so I think it's interesting that he layers in the speculative to keep asking some of the same questions, but maybe with, again, an ability to do that and be healthy for a lifetime and a career. So I think that's an interesting change, while there's a lot of continuity on that spectrum as well.
I'd add to that. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the stories, and I think you're absolutely right. He ultimately moved forward with science fiction or speculative fiction, and he wrote stories like Or the Grasses Grow, Native American issues. He wrote Now Let Us Sleep, science fiction about, genocide. He wrote the story you just touched on, and that was through that lens. And I imagine he probably had more success with that. Obviously, I mean, he won a Hugo Award ultimately, and was able to start publishing some of these stories. But going back to this story, I think it's as good a story that's, I mean, honestly, as good a short story has ever been written, and certainly one of Avram's best. How the hell was it never published? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was thinking about three answers to that question, but I think two are the most important. One, just quickly, then, I do think there's an early career aspect of that, right? That he hadn't yet gotten to that point of having relationships maybe with editors and publishers in the way that would create that smooth ability to get things out there, especially if they're difficult, right? And a couple of decades later, I think he probably could have, but obviously, as we're saying, he had moved into all different other arenas and maybe felt that this was part of his past, rather than a story he wanted to revisit or bring back. So I think that's part of it. But the two ones that I also was thinking about, one, I think there's an unfortunate timing thing where, a decade later, Jewish American fiction explodes, right? People like Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud and others in the 1950s. And so not even a decade later, maybe, but a few years later, a handful of years later, make clear that there's a market, make clear that there's a substantial market for interesting, provocative Jewish American fiction. And I'm not sure that conversation was the same in the 40s. And so I think there's a timing thing, I would say, to some degree, where if Davidson wrote the story after Goodbye Columbus, Philip Roth's debut collection had come out and was this mega bestseller when he was in his late 20s as well, I think there absolutely would have been a clamoring for this story to get out there in a different way a decade later. It is my sense. But the third thing would have still been true, which is that America didn't want to grapple with these histories, and not just the Holocaust, although definitely the Holocaust and our culpability or relationship to it. But again, also, the exclusion of refugees, the exclusion of immigrant arrivals, the continued exclusion of these multiple American communities, not just arrivals, but American communities, as we see in this story. And so I think, for a young writer to write a story that was trying to force us to grapple with those things, to confront those realities behind the fantasies, was going to make it tough to get out there. So I think probably, all of those factors combined. And I'm just glad we now have the chance. I wish it had gotten out there throughout his career as it should have. But I agree with you that it's as good as anything. And it's so important to try to share it and have these conversations.
I mean, when I read it, I just kept thinking of this. I mean, he's essentially, if you read between the lines, he's attacking the U.S. government. I mean, in reality. So I have to imagine it would have been too controversial at that time. Yeah. And those subjects. I mean, he's basically, so much room. Why can't they bring what's the term he uses? Something about the monster, something about the monster. I can't find it, but yeah, I mean, it's if you really think about what this story is talking about, it was excluding how many 6 million Jews that were killed. I mean, that would be tough for, I agree with you, that'd be tough for anyone to tackle.
Mhm.
And probably no one would want to touch this.
And also, you know, that throughout World War II and after World War II, and it also goes to something else you referenced earlier, Seth, which was the inability to grapple with, for example, the experience of African-American soldiers in the war in any particular full way, because World War II so quickly developed into that narrative of the good war, right? Of the US as the good guys in a war. And, you know, with some justification, of course, but it meant maybe flattening a lot of those bumps, right? Flattening a lot of those contradictions and hypocrisies. And again, in the 50s, that starts to change a little bit. You have things like Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which also using kind of like Black comedy and satire and the fantastic starts to poke some holes in some of those ideas of the pure goodness of any war, including World War II. But this is, I think, before that as well. So, you know, some of those narratives beyond even just immigration and the Holocaust of this moment of nobility, this moment of goodness, that this story is also, again, forcing us to turn the mirror in a very different way to think about.
Yeah, and you started alluding to this earlier, how this can connect to modern day and how this struggle just remains. It's the same things that we've never addressed and perpetuates itself. So I was wondering if you can expand a little bit more on the connections you see between this and the lessons that can be drawn from this story and what we see in front of us today in America and globally.
Absolutely, and there are so many, and everything that everyone has been talking about, I think, fall into that conversation importantly. But I would say a couple things. One, I would say so much of the way, and again, it's ironic that a speculative fiction author, someone who eventually became so associated with fantasy in different forms, would offer a window into this, but I think he does, that so much of the way we remember our history are in one way or another fantasies or myths. Right. There's a great new collection called Myth America about some of these kind of defining myths in the way we think about our history. And there's a lot around immigration and inclusion and exclusion and American ideals and so on. And calling them myths doesn't mean that they're false necessarily, right? It means that they're simplified, that they're limited, that they don't include the other side of the coin, that they have realities that they're missing. And so I think partly this is a story, and again, on so many levels, about the world, about other nations and communities, but about America so fully, asks us to think beyond, right? To think about the myths and to think about the realities, and then try to think about how we assemble a story out of them and move forward, right? How we try to live in the reality rather than in the fantasy and the myth. And again, I think that's really relevant to how we talk and debate immigration and inclusion and exclusion, but it's also about our national identity, who we are and how we think about America. And so to me, that's one huge takeaway. And again, it includes lots of specific subcategories, but it's a big question too. It's a national collective question. And every debate we're having right now over education, over so many things are kind of about that ultimately. Like, what story do we tell? And is it going to be the simplified one, or is it going to be the multi-layered, complicated one? And this is a story, I think, about that. But then the other thing that I think maybe is even more important, even though that's what I spend my career thinking about those last questions, but it's a corollary, I guess, but it's maybe even more important, is it's so easy to forget in all those conversations that these are, individual humans, right? These are uncles and kids and families, and trying to have that degree of empathy, of identification for just the human experience. And that's who all these people are, right? Is that they're all individual and again, familial human beings. And this is a story that I think opens that up in all the ways that we've talked about, right? That the narrator just as this kid in this world, in the US in the 1920s, in relationship to Hungary, in relationship to the Holocaust eventually, Moritz in those ways, the grandmother in those ways, right? These are deeply realized human characters dealing with all of that. And that too, I think, is a takeaway we still need, right? We still, I think, have these debates a lot of the time, and I'm guilty of it, I'm sure too, about big questions and policies and ideas and myths and so on, rather than just thinking about the human experience and the human cost and effect and joy and laughter, just all the layers of the human experience. And what makes this story so powerful is that it's both, right? It's the huge questions, but it's so human. And Moritz is such a fully realized, complicated guy, and the narrator in his own way is such a fully realized, complicated character. And so just recognizing those human sides to those huge questions, I think this story really would help us keep doing that in ways that we need to as well.
I keep thinking about the names. I mean, he purposely gives you the names of Mara, Sandor, and Andor, and Tybor. And there's so much in Judaism about, let us not forget, let us remember. And I mean, gives you those names so you remember them. And these people are no more. One of the things that I typically do, and I've been sniffling here because I got so choked up on this, so apologize if it's been coming through, but typically when we have these podcasts, we talk a lot about Avram really he actually lived in Hollywood for a time, and he really had an interest in having some of his stories turned into film or TV series, and he had some success. So I always talk about how would some of these stories work as a film or a movie, and oftentimes we joke about who the actor would be. And in this case, I feel like I'm more interested in your, because I'd have a hard time envisioning this in terms of what you would focus on, number one, and then who would direct it. I mean, who would put this together? Based on who you've seen out there, who could you see doing this story justice?
And I had one initial thought, but then I like my second thought more even. The initial thought was Barry Levinson, the filmmaker Barry Levinson, who was so good at telling the multi-generational family immigration stories, and often specifically Jewish American stories. There's a film of his called Avalon, which is very much about those histories and those stories. And I think, Levinson just had an eye for, again, telling like intimate family sagas that also opened up to these huge questions of immigration and America and the world and the 20th century. And so I thought Levinson, and I think that could be good. But then the other one that I thought that I think is even more interesting for some of the way that fantasy works in this story was Guillermo del Toro. I just was thinking a lot about Pan's Labyrinth, one of my favorite films in recent years, which is about those same things, right? And a kid. The main character of that film is a young girl in the Spanish Civil War who's thinking about all these complicated real questions and yet also fantasy, right? And trying to bring those things together or be torn apart, have a family and a community torn apart by them. And so I just thought it'd be really interesting to think about somebody like Del Toro, taking it, because I agree, how do you envision this? And Levinson's would be very realistic, I think. But I think it might be interesting to have somebody who could really lean into the sort of fantasy sequences, right? The fantasy Hungary, the fantasy America, the fantasy world, while also ultimately bringing it to that human, real layer. And so I think a director or an artist, a storyteller who could do those things like Davidson is doing them could be really a great fit.
I absolutely love it. Anyone have anything to add?
I don't know if we've ever mentioned Guillermo del Toro before for directing Avram's stories, but now that you mentioned that, that'd be perfect for a lot of his stories.
Yeah.
Golem, that would be really good.
Yeah.
And he has, he has that whimsy, he has that childish, sort of sense of the world and even sense of humor. And I think it's important to say, we said this, early in talking about this story, but even though the end hits us in all the ways that you're talking about, Seth, and that we've been talking about, and rightly so, that part of the reason that works so well is that the story has the whimsy and the humor and the lightness that Emma had highlighted and that we've talked about as well. It doesn't feel, dark and traumatic from start to finish. And A, that makes the end hit harder, but B, that's also part of the story and part of the childish narration and perspective, right? Is all those layers of whimsy and again, story and fantasy and family and food and celebration. And I think just to make sure that those wouldn't, be lost in a way that would just feel like a very serious movie, capital VSM, but instead have those other layers as well.
There's this one movie, and I don't know who the director is, but it's called The Triplets of Belleville.
Oh yeah,
know if you've no, okay, well, it's an
animated. Yeah.
Yeah.
and there's not dialogue in it really. And it's a full-length feature film, and it kind of has this creepy, whimsical nature to it. But the thing that I think is the thing, it keeps coming in my mind reading this, and when I listen to it, it's the timing, the relationship to time that film has, and that this piece has, because there's not a lot of music. It's just a lot of waiting, and there's a lot of the buildup in the beginning is this young boy and learning about this young boy's relationship, home relationship, where he lives with his grandma, and you kind of see their sequences of life. And so I'm looking at this, and like time is so interesting to me in this piece, because sometimes they like the anticipation part is so long, and then months pass in tiny little bits, and then years pass, and it's all compressed and stretched in such interesting ways that I would be interested in seeing it as like a short kind of animated film without dialogue, and just expressing just having like Uncle Moritz come in, and what would that look like, and having it be from a kid's perspective and being so vivid, and then really like having to look towards adults to see at the end, to see the reality of the situation from a kid's eyes, and it would also lend itself well to the fantasy. So that's what I had in my brain when I was reading it.
Did anybody, I mean, that aspect of time, did anyone think about the title? And every time I think about the title, I get a little bit, again, I don't know why I'm getting so choked up today, but every time I listen, I think even about that title. What time is it? What does that mean? The first thing that comes to my mind is what time it is. It's time where these people get killed. But any thoughts on the title? And I know that's not the point of the title, but did anyone think anything of the title itself? I'm just curious.
Well, it's what time is it, right?
Capital IS, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So
what time is it?
like, to me, there's like, it's like, there's that implies like some confusion about what the time is. Like, I thought it was something, but everything that's happening around me makes me think something else. It might be another time. And so when I read that, my interpretation of like the deeper meaning is that it's like, really, like, I know this was written, in the 40s, which was to us a long time ago, but from that, even then, like looking at what was happening in the world, like we're in the 1940s, like this isn't the 1600s. What are we doing? Like, what time is it? This is so regressive.
And I think along with, again, that's the hugely important like world historical layer, and then the interpersonal, right, the human one, because, and not just that it's this whimsical catchphrase between uncle or great uncle and nephew as they develop the bond, as folks said really well, but it's also a joke, right? It's a translation error. It's a funny private joke, personal joke, shared inside joke, which is how relationships work in a lot of ways, right? They don't work through the official language. They work through the private and the personal and the whimsical and the inside jokes, and the more we have those, the closer we are and the more intimate we are. And so I think, it's a phrase that's about those huge questions and that captures that layer of the story, and then that means different things even at different moments along that spectrum of like the personal and the political, the private and the public, the whimsical and the tragic, all those layers.
I think so too, especially with the big I and the big S. It really connects to me to, yes, first, let's build the bond, uncle and nephew. We're getting to know each other. It's a joke. That is how their relationship is built. Later, it feels, since Uncle Moritz is stolen, taken away from, he'll never get to see him again. Now he just has like those nightmares of what time is it? What time is it? What time is it? And this story, as far as like the kind of interpersonal connection, I feel there's a lot of regret. If Uncle Moritz had just brought his daughter, maybe she would have survived. If he could have somehow gotten his visa, maybe he would have survived. And if America would have just let the people in, 6 million people might have survived. There's so much regret that I think it is. Please, can we just change something, what time is it? Like you've said, it's, the war has already well, we don't know exactly when this was written, but maybe it has ended, and we still have these kind of exclusionary acts. We still have these quotas. What time is it? Why can't we just change something to not have to regret so much anymore? It's interesting.
Well, this has been amazing. Ben, I can't thank you enough. Is there anything that people want to add? I have a couple of things, but is there anything else that people would like to add before we sign off?
Well, just one quick thing I was going to say to circle back to the idea of classes and students. Besides just my desire, if and when this story might be out there, which I know it is not yet, this is exactly the kind of thing I would love the chance to, to share and teach, because it does have such multiple layers of resonance and engagement and effect, as we've been talking about. But the other thing I was going to say along those lines, one of the classes I get to teach periodically is called a special author, and it's one author for the whole semester. I've done it now 3 different times, most recently with W.E.B. Du Bois, which was a great semester. But this story reminded me, I think in my own head, too often I pigeonhole authors or artists. And so maybe I would have thought Davidson is too much one thing to do for a whole semester, because it would feel repetitive, or it would start to feel like, variations on a theme. But that's not at all the case. And I know that because I read The Treasury. I just had to cast my mind back. But this story reminds me of that as well, that there's so much within some of even the same questions, maybe so much variety and so much depth and breadth, that I would love the chance down the road, hopefully, to use someone like Davidson, to use Davidson specifically in that class as an example of an author who covered so much ground. So just was thinking about that too.
And if you ever need anything from me for that class, and boy, do I wish I could have taken that class.
Yeah, me too.
Will you have it virtual? Because we'd like to attend.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and beyond the Treasury, you got to see a little touches. You got to see Esterhazy, you got to see Lime Killer, you got to see a couple of mysteries in there, I think. But the investigations, the other 19th century, there's so much out there. And Avram tried to leave science fiction so many times, and threatened to leave science fiction so many times, and just kept getting back because he needed a paycheck, but as people do. But yeah, no, fantasy, science fiction, mystery, and just pure literature, I think.
Yeah.
One other thing that I wanted to comment on that you don't know is I spoke to Ethan, Avram's son, my brother, half brother. It gets confusing, but I asked, because I've been reading a lot of Avram's autobiography and a lot of his true stories, and so I was curious if this was based on family history, and he didn't think so. So he thought this was definitely historical fiction, but not necessarily based on Avram's family. Not to say, we all could have had family back there, but he didn't think so, but he wasn't sure, but he felt pretty confident it wasn't. But if it was, he also said Avram wouldn't have talked about it. He didn't talk about World War II when he was, he saw some really bad things. And he didn't talk about, he might not have talked about this either, but this I think is purely historical fiction. If I had to guess, I think we've both felt pretty confident about that. So.
And just one other thing then about the story that I was thinking of when Emma and Robert, you were sharing your takes on the title. There's a way in which the story is kind of like, in which the narrator has a complicated sort of secondhand version of something like PTSD, right? They've gone through a trauma. It's a collective trauma. He didn't personally experience it in the same way, of course. But, and so just thinking about that idea of like what we repress, right? What we don't want to talk about or tell. But obviously, I think the story's goal is to tell it, right? Is to share the things and talk about them, rather than just, have them in nightmares or have them in memories that we're trying to repress. And that made me think a little, both of my grandfathers fought in World War II, but my maternal one, who was again a Jewish American, second generation Jewish American kid, ends up fighting in World War II and was one of the first Americans to get to a concentration camp at the end of the war but didn't talk about that until like the very, very end of his life. He told that story one time in any of our hearing, really briefly, didn't want to talk about it much, but was one of the first to arrive. He was an officer and he was one of the first to arrive at this. I don't know what camp it was. Again, he talked about it very little. And so just that idea of like the things we don't talk about, right? The traumas, the memories, but the goal of talking about them, the goal of sharing them. I think this story is about all of that too. And it sounds like Davidson had his complicated version of that in his life, but certainly it's a story about that, at least on a shared level for sure.
Well, this has been amazing. Again, I can't thank you enough. Emma and Robert, thanks for everything you've been doing. Happy 100th birthday, Avram.
Happy 100th birthday.
And hope we get a bunch more great stories out there.
Great.
It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.